All right. Welcome to the Deep Lore Econ Chat. This is Radical Liberation from St. Louis, Missouri, United States. And I have with me, as usual, the Mad Mercenary from somewhere in Australia. Two short newsy items to cover, and then we're going to get into maybe more of a debate than a discussion this time about free trade. So, coronavirus. So it just so happened that I was talking to a coworker in Beijing, and I thought I would share a little of what he shared with me because I thought it was interesting. He says the streets are mostly empty. Everybody at our office over there is pretty much working from home. He says almost no one goes in to the office unless they're just going to get their laptop. And I said, does the guy with the hazmat suit hand you your laptop? You know, but anyway, he doesn't know because he hasn't been there. He also, I don't want to forget to mention about Wuhan, which is something I didn't realize. Then he also mentioned that they're using the masks, which I recognize from bird flu days. They were still wearing them when I was first visiting Hong Kong and Beijing some years ago, after the bird flu thing that happened around 2003, I think. And then he says that's pretty much like, he said, if you're in the mask business, you could strike it rich because the prices are very high for masks. And if you appear on the street without one, you will be arrested. So I thought that was interesting. Also, he mentioned something about Wuhan that maybe I thought I'd been kind of following this story, but I missed this. He said that the issue is that, Chinese New Year hit right as the news was coming out about the concerns about the coronavirus. And before, let me get this right. Yeah, before they started locking everything down, he said 500 people left from Wuhan and scattered throughout China, because I know this from Beijing. I was actually there the week before Spring Festival is what they actually call it, Chinese New Year, Spring Festival. And as the week went on, I saw the office emptying and people are saying, yeah, I'm going back to Inner Mongolia or whatever, wherever they really are from, and they just come to Beijing for work, basically. Well, similarly with Wuhan, people leave for Chinese New Year and they go back to their village that they came from. So he said 500. I was like, oh. And he said, oh, I'm sorry, I said the wrong number. 5 million. 5 million people left Wuhan to go home, basically throughout China, before they went into this lockdown mode. So I haven't seen a heat map or whatever, but if you're seeing that there's reports, not just in Wuhan, where I guess the coronavirus really got kicked off, if you're seeing reports of the coronavirus infection happening throughout China, now you know why. A good chunk of Wuhan went home for the holidays, right when the infection was spreading. So I thought that was an interesting update on coronavirus. And as I shared with my friend, I'm praying for them. So next topic. You had something that I would call imperial news, which is a topic we haven't covered really yet on this show, but I hope to get into it on Political Economy Weeks. So yeah, tell us what you've been learning, and I should put this article up, right?
Sure. So basically, over the past week, China's made inroads with the Philippines. They've made inroads with all the Northeast and Southeast Asian nations. Taiwanese election scandals, influence in Vietnam and in Indonesia, and huge bribery scandals in the Philippines. And this looks to be another step closer towards China for the Philippines. They're ending the visiting forces agreement with the United States, which basically allows the United States forces to leave their bases and train and adapt to the environment. That's being ended, and the Philippines is looking to go more towards China, and this is good for a couple reasons for China. It helps them secure the first island chain. It gives them a few ports on the western side of the Philippines. The bad thing for China is that it's really, really hard to bribe someone when when your economy goes to hell and your currency isn't worth very much, which is what China's facing, as we discussed in previous shows. And so, people in that sort of region are only friendly to you as long as you keep paying them. So when you can't keep paying them, they're no longer your friend. And with the Philippines, they may not be a friend that you even want, because the Philippines is, as a nation, as we discussed previously in Rothbard's article about what a nation is, about ethnic groups and religious belief and language, they're not a nation. There's about 20 different languages, hundreds of different ethnicities. They are not unified, and right now they're going through civil conflict. So the Philippines is the kind of friend that you wish was your enemy, unfortunately for China. So that's an update on Asian news.
Yeah. I guess being in Australia, you're probably going to be a little more keyed in to what's going on in Asia than I am. That's going to be my guess, right?
Yeah, I follow Asia a bit closer since it's near where I am.
Right. Okay. Well, that makes sense. So help me understand. So this shows us the Philippines backing away from the USM, being just a part of the U.S. empire, right? The bases are still there, but now they're going. The idea is they'll be more contained, and I guess it'd be a prelude to maybe asking the bases to not be there anymore, right?
Right, and this doesn't exactly hurt. This doesn't hurt the United States in any way. They don't have strong vested interest in the Asian theater anymore, apart from some of the big powers like Japan. But it's just the sign of the times.
Sorry, crunching apple. But so that's the drawing away from the U.S. But tell me about the part where they're drawing towards China. Can you give a little hint of what you've been seeing?
Lots of bribery, notorious for political corruption and manipulation of courts and the political system there. Basically, just money politics. So,
wait, you mean Chinese? You didn't say who's doing the bribery.
Money.
Okay, I
Sorry,
see.
Chinese.
So Chinese money is coming into Philippines and sort of making it into the environment the Chinese want it to be, say.
Right. So development plans and promising a whole bunch of investment and directly bribing a few politicians and a few judges to get their way. And we saw this back in the late 70s with the Russians, with the Soviet Union, and they were doing the same thing with a lot of mid-Asian powers, so Afghanistan, that sort of places. And I think the Chinese are going to find the same result, that as soon as you stop paying these people, they're no longer your friend.
Right.
They're there for
Go ahead.
No, they're just there for the money.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to share a link. The show that we are no longer competing with, I hope, namely the Cigar Stream with Academic Agent. He had a chat recently, and I would just like to share that because they touched on this very issue. Yeah, just putting that in.
How are we,
Okay,
chat?
sorry. Yeah, so sorry. So I just put in the pointer to his chat with a YouTuber from South Africa. And he described this pattern that you're talking about. In fact, one of the things that struck Academic Agent so much in that conversation is that China is doing such a good job of, as you say, kind of bribing their way into making things the way they want to be, that legally speaking, when it comes to, like you need a certain number of black people to be involved with the business for it to be legit, Like they've got laws
Asians
like
count as
this.
black.
Chinese count as black. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
It's ridiculous.
So it's amazing. And the other pattern he described, which you're describing with the Philippines, is where China will loan money to the government for like infrastructure projects or something like that, right? And then the government is on the hook to China for paying these loans back, these large loans.
Yes, correct. And so what we see, we've seen this in other places as well. So the Philippines and South Africa are not unique in this.
Right. Right.
What's really interesting about this is that the Philippines is within the first island chain. So if the Philippines can be turned, then that's one step closer for the Chinese to secure the first island chain and secure the South China Sea.
Right. Okay, so that's not a terrible intro to our topic, is it?
No, it's not.
It actually segues rather nicely, because we want to think today about free trade, and we want to think about it in, how shall we put it, in a very realistic, grounded way in the way the world is and the way the world works, which includes, for example, trading between countries that don't have a land passage and need to, if you're going to trade with that country, you're going to have to get your goods over to them, say, by way of water. So that's the segue, but hold that thought for a moment. And why don't we get that first thing up there? Okay, it's coming. Okay, there we go. All right, so what are we looking at?
We are looking at, hold on, let me bring the title down because I didn't get that ready. All right, trade has grown remarkably over the last century. So this is the value of global exports over the last, let's say, 200 years. And as you can see, the value has grown exponentially from the 1800s all the way to today. And just to set us all off, I understand some people, this will be a very, well, no duh moment, but we're trying to establish from the beginning that trade holds value, and when we trade, we all become more prosperous, and we can specialize into different roles, and because of competitive advantage, we all benefit. Agreed?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, we're going into the idea of free trade versus free trade agreements, and I have a Mises article about that. So if we want to change tabs real quick.
Oh, I thought you were going to show us a little more of just the development.
Oh, you want the other ones?
Well, what do you think? I was just thinking, let's first sort of show in a couple different ways the significance of. Now it's funny, right? Because in economics, we don't use the term trade in the way that it tends to be used in the popular manner. In economics, a trade can be between me and my brother in my house, right, or whatever. In popular lingo, when we say trade, we really mean what economists would call international trade between people in that are in different states, right? And so that's what this is a measure of. In fact, when it talks global exports, it means you're exporting out of the United States to Mexico or to Canada. If you're exporting from Missouri to Illinois, it doesn't get counted here, which means that in a way you're not really seeing an accurate picture, right? Because why should Liechtenstein to Germany or whatever, going across the border count as international trade and figure into these statistics, where California to Massachusetts, which is way, a couple thousand miles apart, that doesn't count as an export or international trade. But anyway, so we're really looking at the phenomenon. When we talk about trade or free trade, we're really talking about trading between people in different states. So yeah, do you think you could show us a couple more things that illustrate what a huge... Okay, so this picture is great because it shows us that global exports has grown, but it doesn't show us how exports relative to everything else we're doing in the domestic economy. And that's what struck me about one of your other chart you had, if you could pull that up.
Is that the one? Just a little
Try it.
as share of GDP. There we go.
Yeah, there we go. That's really interesting, right? In fact, I'm gonna have to make it bigger to see it. Okay. Right. So, okay, this shows that trade has been significant through the late 19th century, which we expected. It shows a dip with the Depression and World War II, right? And then a recovery to 19th century levels by, wow, it takes a while, till almost the 70s or even almost the 80s, until we're back to where we were in the 19th century. And this, I'm sorry, this is across countries? This is not a particular country, right?
No, this is global.
Global, yeah. So everybody's GDP, everybody's exported goods, and then this is what we're looking at, the percentage. So it's not till the 80s that we get back firmly up or above the 19th or early 20th century, I should say, heights of global trade. But then it just really shoots up, right? And so it's not quite double 19th century levels, but yeah, it's pretty close to double the amount of the economy is exported goods relative to the great free trade era of the 19th century. So from the point of view of these stats, we are in a much greater free trade period of history than we were even in the time when people believed in free trade back in the 19th century, whereas now I'm not so sure they do.
So what we can see from here is that with more people coming into free trade, obviously after the 80s, we've seen the fall of the Soviet Union and communism being discredited, and more peoples being free to trade. We've especially the rise of Asian countries, so India, Bangladesh, China, notably. We've seen that it's just risen just exponentially in the value of exports and the amount that exports make up of GDP. Even though GDP is a false statistic.
I don't know if you can help me tell this story, but I just wanted to do a quick footnote on India, because I think everyone knows that, you know, China was under communism and they were pretty much cut off from the world economy, certainly relative to what they have now become. But I don't know that the story of India is as well known. Maybe it's more well known among the, you know, in Britain, where they have a closer connection to India because the empire. But India had this philosophy. It's even in their flag. There's a spinning wheel on the flag of India. And this was some kind of philosophy that like Gandhi had, that you should like make everything yourself or something like that. Basically, they had a philosophy of like autarky. And my understanding is that for quite a while after the independence of India, they kind of sort of followed that. Very, very high tariffs and so on and so forth kept them pretty disengaged from the worldwide economy. And that did change, but it changed like in my lifetime. I mean, it wasn't that long ago. It was, you know, in several decades maybe. Maybe more like, let's say, maybe the 80s or 90s is really where we see a shift. Did you know anything about that story, Madmark?
Yeah, I understood from Gandhi's ideas that he wanted India to be self-sufficient.
Self-sufficient.
So he didn't want them to be reliant on other nations because they're obviously a very poor nation at the time. So he didn't want them to be reliant on them for clothing or food, all the essential things. So he set out a policy of high tariffs, restrictions on trade. Notably, India at this time was getting very buddy-buddy with the Soviet Union as anti-colonialist activities. The partition of India between Pakistan and India left a sour taste in everyone's mouth. So it kind of pushed them in that political direction towards more of a socialized system. And even today, the regulatory burden on Indian domestic businesses and any outside businesses who want to do business in India is very high. I mean,
right.
Have you seen some of the videos of the Indian parliament just beating the absolute living crap out of each other? It's hilarious.
No, I don't know about that. Hey, I did want to address one question real quick, just because we have the right picture on the screen to address it. Idle Time says, how much does the 20th century trade drop have to do with the fall of the British and French empires. So we're talking, right, about this dip we see through like the 30s, 40s, right? I don't think that's what it is, because I think it has more to do with the stock market crash and then the subsequent depression. That's my. If you look carefully at this graph, it'd be nice to have something that focuses in on that period. But I believe really the decline right there is like 1929. I'm pretty sure it's like right on the money. It's 1929. I may be wrong.
I would say, yeah, that's, I think, from that dip there is 1929, and then subsequently World War II, which
Right.
messes with trade, as we know.
Yep.
But then if you have a look after World War II, in this period, 1952 till 1971, this is of and we see that it kind of stagnates there. It stays at that level. I think that's the effect of decolonization. We kind of stagnated during that period. These new nations are trying to find their feet. We understand that from the European perspective, they've lost their empire. They've just come out of World War II. We understand, especially with the British, that Attlee and Labour governments, they're nationalizing a lot of things, making them less competitive. So I think that's the result of the fall of these empires. We have stagnation.
Right. Good point from Rogers that should be added, which is the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which took effect in 1930. Would have been part of the story, but of course, it's a little hard to disentangle because we were having a worldwide depression at the time, right?
Right.
So yes, the tariff probably didn't help, but it's hard to pick apart how much was there, basically a trade war going on, and how much was it just that everyone was suddenly too broke to buy anything, right?
Yeah.
Okay, right. So I think we've laid a little bit of the groundwork of how international trade has gone up and down over the last 100 years or so, is I think the window we're particularly interested in. And then, yeah, take us into the next part of our conversation, Madmerk. You lay it out.
All right. So we have free trade versus free trade agreements. And I believe I have the article sharing there if you want to just approve that.
Yep.
Yes. So
my old friend Jeff Tucker.
We have free trade versus free trade agreements. I will lay out the argument that free trade does not need free trade agreements. I believe that there is some agreement necessary between nations. However, these do not need to be lengthy 2,000 page or 10,000 page agreements that we've seen in the past. These need to be at max 20 pages. I think there still needs to be some sort of framework, but I believe that free trade does not need the extensive, overblown bureaucracy that we are led to believe. I think you're of the opposite opinion, however, Redlib.
No, I think we might mostly agree. Let me further point out, though, that just to bring this a little more to recent events, it seems to me that the European Union has been a really good case study in this, right? Because originally it wasn't the original name like the European Free Trade Zone or something like that? It wasn't called the European Union originally, right?
Yes, Commerce Zone or Coal and Steel Community, something like that.
Yeah, right. Originally, it was very much meant to be about trade. And of course, now we see they're talking about like having their own EU army and all that, but basically taking on all the markers of a state. But originally, it was just, hey, we're going to do better if we have free trade within Europe. But what I think we saw develop over time, This is a little bit different than free trade agreements per se, though those were certainly involved. What we saw develop over time is that the European Union, though I think it kept, well, I was going to say it kept trade free within Europe, but I'm not even sure that's quite right, because they got into so much regulation that I think they were probably started to have started to have a corrosive effect on trade within Europe, because you've got to make things up to EU standards to trade it within Europe, right? And then anyway, there's a internal to EU story. And then what, of course, really interests us as we see Brexit happening, for example, is what is the relationship between the trading relationship between the EU and people outside of the EU. And there, it's hard to say that free trade has much to do with that story. I understand that there's a lot of, protection of French farmers and on and on and on, So if you're going to make a deal with the EU, an official free trade, one of these 1,000-page document things, they're going to make you put in stuff to protect all their various special interest groups that have are sucking on the teat of the EU in one way or another, right?
Right, and then at that point, it doesn't become free trade anymore. It just becomes a normal trade agreement that has lots of protectionist tariffs and that is inefficient and makes the end consumer, being EU citizens or the citizens of the nation that is trading, worse off. It makes all parties worse off.
Right, and so part of the challenge here, as so often with economics, I would like to say, is literally rhetoric, right? The agreements are often called, sometimes they even have the term free trade in them, right? So isn't NAFTA the North American Free Trade Agreement? Yes, it is. The F and the T in NAFTA is free trade. So people are like, you're against NAFTA, so you're against free trade? Well, hold up there. Just because it has the word free trade in it doesn't mean that you're getting what's on the label, right? And that's the point you're making.
This is a political branding game. So if you, for example, you can call something free healthcare, or free TV, or free internet, or these things are not free. Someone's obviously paying for them, but the branding is fantastic. You're saying to these people that you're going to get something for nothing, which, as we know in economics, never happens. Right.
So basically the offer rhetorically, not what's really being offered, but what is implied by the rhetoric, by the labeling, is you're really going to get healthcare for free. And we're really going to have trade between countries that's free. The NAFTA, for example, is, I believe, between Mexico, Canada, and the US. Well, NAFTA is how we have trade that's free between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. That's what the rhetoric is saying. What most people don't see, but I know some people who have spent time looking through these agreements, is the details. And the details, so as you said, if we even need an agreement at all, it could be extremely short. It could literally be, let's say a US-Canada free trade agreement, a true free trade agreement, right? It could literally be, we will not have any tariffs on Canadian goods. And Canada says, we will not have any tariffs on US goods. Okay, deal, shake. That could be it. And that would be a true free trade agreement. That would not take thousands of pages. But as it happens, these free trade agreements are extremely lengthy. And what's inside them, Mad Merc?
As someone who read the Phase 1 trade agreement between China and the US from beginning to end, and is going through NAFTA at the moment, it's full of a whole bunch of protectionist tariffs, and it is not designed for free trade. It is designed for political and national security goals in mind. It is designed to put one nation on top in a certain way and put the other one in a subservient position. So, for example, NAFTA 2.0, when the Canadians came to the table, they were basically forced to sign it. it didn't help their farmers because of tariffs and all that good stuff that hurts free trade, but they were forced to sign it because the US is essentially their guarantor. So this was used as a political cudgel. The Phase 1 China agreement has so many caveats in there about the restriction of what the Chinese can sell to the United States and how much the Chinese have to buy from the United States in agricultural good and manufacturing goods. The fact that some companies can no longer operate within the United States, which I actually happen to agree with, and I think this is going to be one of our disagreeing points.
So wait a second. I wanted to pause on the previous point, though, you said, because I think that's very interesting. There's these like, what do you call them? Purchasing obligations or something, right?
Yes.
And it's very bizarre. And so I'm amazed that you went through that. I'm thrilled to have you on, to be able to talk to you about this with you having gone through those details. For one thing, it's sort of like, how do I put it? I think Lou Rockwell went through NAFTA, and he talked about it as being like taking one for the team, like this is not like a great idea of anyone's fun time, not even people like us who have some interest in economics and what's going on internationally. Still, this is not a party to go through one of these agreements, right?
No, it's not.
Yeah. Anyway, so I'm thrilled that you did it. Thank you. Thank you for your service. What happens if you don't, China agrees in this agreement that we will buy $100 billion of whatever it is, fish or whatever, steel or something. What if China doesn't do it? The agreement would go on to have like penalties in it and stuff, right?
Right. So there were harsh penalties, as in, for example, on the extreme case, the whole disillusionment and dissolvement of the deal of the Phase 1 agreement. There were high tariffs. I can't remember off the top of my head, but intermediate punishments, so high tariffs being reintroduced, like 25% tariffs on industrial goods coming into the United States from China. I believe I read somewhere.
Those are the penalties if they don't
penalties. So
then tariffs shoot up, basically.
Yes. So for this agreement, tariffs go back down. If the agreement is broken, then as a punishment, the tariffs go back up.
Right.
And so we see this throughout the agreement. So, for example, in the agreement we see that China is no longer to steal private information of companies and the end users of those companies. So, for example, Huawei can no longer spy on their end users. Chinese can no longer steal the information and plans of private companies operating within China. This is something that China can't actually abide by because their whole system runs off this. So they're going to fall through on that, and then they use this as a political cudgel to hit China again.
Right.
So these free trade agreements, quote unquote, have political and national security goals in mind first and foremost, and economic prosperity, making your citizens live in prosperity and live a better life and have cheaper goods. That's secondary.
Right. Yeah. So in other words, big shock. These agreements between governments are about the interests of the governments. Right.
Who would have guessed?
Yeah. Oh no. We've lost our innocence once again. So yeah. Also, I gather, now I haven't studied this agreement, but you have, so tell me. I also gather that there tends to be some, how shall we put it, faddish things. Some global warming sprinkled on there, some intellectual property, right?
Right. So intellectual property theft is what I went over before. So China is obviously heavily into that. So is France, but we don't talk about that for some reason. But the climate change stuff. So let's talk about the Paris Accord, for example. These international agreements, they're not binding. So Chinese are not has said, well, we're going to reduce emissions by 30%, just random number. I haven't gone over the Paris Accord yet. They're not binding, however. So China can say they can do all these sorts of things all they want, but no one's forcing them to do that. They don't have to do it because they're classed as a developing nation rather than a developed nation. So they get an exemption. So is India. They have that exemption as well. So is Bangladesh. So is Vietnam. So all these nations that say, well, we're going to reduce emissions, we're not bound by that. They don't fulfill on that. They pay lip service to that to keep everyone off their back. And that's the basic of all these agreements. It's political goals in mind rather than economic.
Right. Okay. So there's some substantive stuff in there, which substantive in the sense that it will have real economic effects, right? If these tariffs go back up, if they really buy more than they need to of something because they agreed to in the stupid trade agreement, right? That all that kind of stuff has real effects and is destructive, frankly, to the economy, right? And a bunch of needless regulations. But you're saying there's also a bit of just like virtue signaling in there, right?
Yes, 100%.
Yeah. Stuff that maybe it doesn't have too much harm. I don't know. Have to see the details, right? But it's basically there so they can wave it and say, hey, we're good people. In our 1,000-page trade agreement, we virtue signaled in the right ways or whatever,
Right. So in the trade agreement between China and the United States, there's a whole 3 pages dedicated to the regulation and maintaining of good quality over shipment of baby formula.
Mm-hmm.
Baby food formula.
Yeah.
So, you can't make this stuff up.
Right. And just to, I kind of mentioned it in the EU thing, but another thing you see as you go through it, I'm assuming, without having seen it, I'm going to just prophesy and guess, and you tell me if I'm right. You could just about make the list of which lobbies are making good donations by going through that trade agreement, right?
Yeah, you can.
You basically see that here's the oh shoot, I was going to name that corn company, not Enron, but I'm forgetting. Anyway, but here's the section that this company or this industry bought. Here's the section that this industry bought. Like everybody's got their little thing in there that serves their interests, but not necessarily, and almost certainly, probably not the interests of consumers, right?
Right.
Idle Time says Monsanto.
Monsanto.
Did you sense a Monsanto section in there somewhere?
There were definitely corn buying was definitely within the trade agreement. Agricultural purchases and agricultural equipment purchases were definitely in there.
Yep. Okay, so I think we're largely in agreement that these free trade agreements are not what they say on the 10. They are, in fact, agreements between states where special interests get payoffs, in essence, where there's lots of tripwires in there for tariffs to shoot back up. It has to do with the interests of the governments, with their political jockeying or whatever, and it's not a beautiful document about how we just want to take care of the people and the consumers. That's really not in there. And of course, I'm opposed to intellectual property. I think it's a sort of a fraudulent notion. So that particular section, I wouldn't buy into myself, the stuff about intellectual property. But you're saying that you wouldn't get it down to those like 2 sentences that I suggested. We shall make no tariffs on you and you shall make no tariffs on us. You wouldn't go quite that low, right?
No, I wouldn't. I'm not talking about, when I say this, I want to clarify, I'm not talking about tariffs or taxes on certain goods. I'm against that. I think that hurts the consumer, that hurts the people.
Right.
What I'm talking about is malicious behavior by countries and state-owned entities that operate for the other country's national interest.
Mm-hmm.
So again, in this trade agreement, we see that certain companies are banned from operating within the United States, Huawei being a key example.
Right, and
We know that
we could just pause and say that it was quite controversial in the UK when Huawei was Boris Johnson's government signed off on Huawei playing a big role in their 5G rollout. Isn't that
right,
right? Yeah, yeah.
right, because we know that Huawei has deep connections to Beijing. We
Mm-hmm.
know that they are essentially another intelligence arm of the Communist Party. We know that they hack into government institutions. We know that they're uh, highly corrupt. There's a case going on in Canada about Huawei. So we know that this is a threat to national security. And in a trade agreement, I would have no problem with banning them from operating within the country's borders because of how much of a risk they are to not only the state, but individuals' personal lives and their data and their uh, right to privacy.
Right.
So
Okay. So this is really, I think you're correct to position this as really a completely different consideration than the traditional protectionist considerations, which is just economic nonsense, as we know, right? That
right,
by putting up tariffs, we'll make you richer while we tax you for the things you want to buy from abroad. It just makes no sense. I mean, it's hard to even state it in a way that doesn't make me laugh. And you're having none of that. But you're saying that there are genuine security concerns, and it isn't just about protecting the state, the interests of the state. It can be part of that, and we can debate over how legitimate or illegitimate that is. But you're saying it could even go further and just be a security concern overall for individuals and people, that we just
right.
have bad actors in the world. And you might want to just say, no, thank you. We can do without that because it just comes with too much poison in it, right?
Right. Speaking particularly of poison, that's a great point. So I mentioned before about baby food and baby formula, but years before that, there had been cases of babies being poisoned and
Yeah,
dying in the United States because baby formula had high traces of zinc in it from these
right.
Chinese companies.
Coming from
So
China. Yeah, I
coming
remember
from
hearing
China,
about
because
that. Yeah.
these are bad actors who don't operate in good faith. Now, that's because of the Chinese system and cheap loans, and we've been over all this. But
Mm-hmm.
when you have a institution and a nation that doesn't act in good faith or act in a charitable way, you do have to sometimes look at this nation and say, do we really want to have no restrictions on what they bring to our nation? Even though it can damage the society, it can damage the health of our people and damage the national security of our people.
Right. So this seems to me it's a little bit separate. It gets mixed in with it, right? Like in
Right.
what we were discussing with the European Union, it's a little bit separate from the topic of trade versus protectionisms per se. It's more like safety standards and kind of consumer protection kind of stuff, right?
Yeah. But the problem here is that these free trade agreements, they wrap all of these sorts of concepts into one big box, one big
Yeah,
bow, you know?
that's true.
They
Yeah.
encompass it all. And so in trying to separate all this out, well, we don't like the tariffs, but maybe some of the protection stuff is justified. But then on the other hand, you go to the other extreme of the EU and
Mm,
their regulatory burden, and
yeah.
these safety standards are used as protectionism again.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's the minarchist versus anarchist debate. It's like this little bit of government, is it okay? But then it balloons out to this
Right.
horrible bureaucracy that's justified by everything and anything.
Yeah. And you're back to the bureaucrat at the dock measuring things and all that,
Yep,
these sort of
exactly.
absurd things where the state is essentially taking over a function that perhaps the market could have done better. Right.
Right.
Okay. I think actually we've covered a lot of what we'd like to say, and I would like to cut to questions pretty quickly here because we've got some good stuff in here, and I want to make sure we have time to have some commentary on some of these things they're bringing up. Is that okay, or did you feel like you had a major point that you hadn't gotten into? Oh, well, what we didn't get into is that thing I hinted at, which is, and I don't know if we even want to try that today, but keeping the oceans free for trade, right?
Yes.
Well, why don't you just state your position on that real quick? And I'm not sure I'm going to debate it right this moment because it kind of gets into a different topic. But
Maybe next time.
Yeah, why don't you just state your position on it as a teaser, and I'll add that to our topics document. All right.
I don't think free trade can happen without overwhelming force. So I believe that national navies are required, and for a nation to have secured its trade, it must have a navy to patrol its trade. And so this is why we had the emergence of empire, and still have, in the form of the United States, even though I don't really count that as an empire, but I understand that.
I do.
Radcliffe does. I have a few qualms about that, but the United States, for example, patrols the seas and patrols the oceans and is relatively hands-off. It doesn't interfere mostly with people's trade. And so free trade flourishes because it's protected, and they understand that the United States doesn't use its military force in order to influence itself.
Right. The navies are there to keep the seas free from pirates, and also, it has to be said, states that would decide to go out there and tax your ship as it goes by or something, right?
Exactly. And we saw back in the early years of empire that these nations had to have large navies. So Britannia rules the waves, that we all know, and we see that the British Empire, because of its trade, became very wealthy, and they had a large navy to protect that trade from other empires. And so I think that's the reason that this trade happens, because it's protected, because they understand that you're not every year you're going to be hit with some new nation who goes to war with another nation and your ship's caught in the middle. You always have that guarantor. Now, I understand you have a different opinion on that.
Yeah, but let's save that and let's hit some questions, because I do want to wrap up on the hour pretty much. Okay, so let's see. I'm looking for ones that we want to, ones that are more than LOL. Let's see. Alessio, our friend from Italy, says free trade agreements are just books full of tariffs. It's a good way of putting it, I think. Doug Nemeth says free trade agreement is free trade, in quotes free trades with regs. Let's see, back on the coronavirus thing very quickly. The Chinese Communist Party seems to be freaking out.
Indeed.
Yeah, we're not going to go too much in that. Doug Nemeth says you get what you deserve, play God with viruses and you'll get bit. I think he's referring to the idea that this might have been coming out of a lab. Marshall Gaunt says you aren't competing with AA, but you are with Britisher. We have slightly different audiences in that case, so I think we'll be a little better. Also competing with Count Dankula. Oh, geez. Okay, so Benevolent Owl. One of my thoughts that I've had with free trade when defending it, how do we not fall into the same argument reasoning as the democracy crew? Okay, well, I kind of know what he's getting at. Sort of it's the end of history because now we're all liberal democracies that believe in free trade, and we just need to impose this at the point of a gun on everybody, and then, then life will be great for everybody. Well, I think the topic, what we focused on is a key issue. That is that when you are standing for true free trade as opposed to free trade agreements, that's a really important distinction, right? Just as those who, I was going to try to draw a comparison with democracy, but I'll save that. So I think actually this distinction between free trade and free trade agreements is really key. because these liberal Democrat types are the ones who are wanting to push for NAFTA and so forth. And they don't tend to be very sympathetic. It's a pretty small number. I've seen it when we had fights over NAFTA in this country. It's a pretty small number of us, Mises Institute, and just a few who see through something like NAFTA and say this is not free trade, and literally oppose the agreement because overall they think it's a move in the wrong direction. So any other thoughts on that one?
No, I completely agree with what you're saying there.
Thank you. Okay, Lumberg says flatline in 70s due to the OPEC crisis. I don't know enough about that. Do you know whether that had that dramatic of an effect on trade internationally?
Well, oil is the largest raw good that's shipped around the world. So
right, and oil facilitates moving things around, right? It's both. It's both something we're shipping around. It's something that lets us ship things around.
Yeah, so it would definitely have a large effect, no doubt.
Yeah. Okay, we covered that. Let's see. Lumberg, in response to the earlier comment from Idle Time that we discussed about the drop, the decolonializing drop, Lumberg says it was a rejection of all the values of the empire. That's an interesting point.
Yes.
That, as we discussed with India, maybe it happened with some other countries too. Hey, that trade stuff, that's part of, the white overlord. We're trying to do something new, and so we're going to reject everything, including, throw some baby out with the bathwater.
Well, this happened with South Africa with Nelson Mandela. This happened in Rhodesia.
Right.
This happened in India. This happened in Pakistan. This happened in Iran, as we can see. We had the imperialist and being called the imperialists and the great Satan and the little Satan by the Iranians in their revolution. So that this whatever was anti the colonial power, these nations moved towards, and we can see the result. They've become poor.
Right. They were discussing about the EU being a protectionist bloc. And Lumberg says it was far from free trade, fishing rights, CAP, etc. So CAP is the Common Agricultural Policy. And I don't know the details of CAP, but I gather it involves, as I said, protecting French farmers and stuff, Let's see. Okay, Rogers That 95 says, is reading through NAFTA what drove Mad Merc to drink and embarrass himself on Discord voice chat?
No, that was a different night of drinking.
Okay, that was not.
That was something much worse that night, but whatever.
That was not an agreement that time. Okay, you already addressed this. How legitimate is the protection of national security interests in the Chinese agreement? Do they actually help? And you're arguing that that is at least something that we could debate as a separate matter, separate from tariffs, which we know are just dumb. Okay, let's see. Hats off for reading 2 trading agreements. You're still working on the second one, right?
I'm still working on the second one.
Yeah.
The one with Canada and Mexico is it's interesting because the one with Canada kind of seems more like a punch to the face, whereas the one with Mexico, even with all the rhetoric that's been going around, seems more like a handshake.
Huh.
So
really?
I don't know.
So the U.S.-Canada one is pretty harsh.
Well,
harsh
what it used to be.
U.S. is giving Canada kind of a worse deal than it's had.
It's not horrible. It's just not as good. And the one with Mexico is becoming better, much better, even with Lopez Obrador in the Mexican presidency.
Yeah, he seems to, they painted Trump as being all like racist against Mexico or something like that. But I had already picked up on the fact that it's a little more complicated. Lumberg says GM seed, which is genetically modified plant seeds or crop seeds, right? GM seed is being debated in the UK-US agreement. Furthermore, that would require a change of UK law. Oh, so I didn't know this. Are genetically modified crops or foods and seeds or whatever illegal in the UK? Whereas I think they're legal in the US, right?
I have no idea. But
Yeah,
we've been genetically modifying plants for 1,000 years now, so I don't
I know.
see why.
Yeah,
why
I
it should
know.
be.
I don't know what to think of that. I mean, we did it by crossbreeding or whatever, right? The monks were doing
Yeah,
this throughout the Middle Ages.
exactly.
So yeah, I'm not sure what to think about these concerns about genetically. But anyway, point is, it's another thing that's in another one of these things that gets in the agreements. Let's see. I'm British, but William M. Hero. I don't know how to say that. I'm British. They get 35% of the market and aren't allowed near military or Navy bases. The government said they couldn't find a back door. They can go through the front, as it's Chinese law to comply. Do you know the context for that? Is that Huawei?
I think maybe Huawei, or I don't.
I think
I
it
don't
is. That's the context, because the next comment is from Lumberg. Huawei already supply most of the UK's wired DSL and 21CN tel infrastructure. I don't know what 21CN tel. Anyway, internet and telephone and stuff, sounds like.
Yeah, I would be very cautious about what you say on the phone then.
Yeah. Let's see. The U.S. Navy has done that since the 40s. I think at this point he's referring to keeping the seas free or whatever.
Correct.
They said they'd protect the trade in exchange for an alliance to fight the Soviets.
Correct.
Okay. Oh, you're saying that is how that came about?
Yeah.
But wait, who was an alliance? I mean, we didn't. Did the U.S. military, U.S. Navy stop trade to communist countries or something?
There was definitely restrictions to communist countries because they're a strategic enemy. But they were definitely protecting the trade of other nations, so the European powers, especially South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, Malaya, Japan. You know, we went over this with the Japan stream, with the Marshall Plan. All these sort of
okay. I didn't think about trade and the high seas as being part of the story. That's interesting. I didn't know about that. So yeah, you're saying that you get on our side on the Cold War, and we'll make sure your ships don't get attacked by pirates, etc. Basically,
pirates, enemy nations. You no longer have to have a large navy, which is a huge expense, and then you can use that for other goods.
Lumberg says U.S. Navy has taken on the role of the Royal Navy, which is exactly what you're saying.
Yes.
that we look at the 19th century and then we roll into the 20th century.
Well, the Royal Navy really did protect the British Empire rather than like protecting all of the West, which is what the U.S. Navy does. But it's essentially, yes, the same role.
Okay, what else? William Savory says they pay farmers for the amount of land and not what is produced on it. I'm familiar with that in the United States. They'll literally be tossing food away or just not bothering to grow because the way the subsidy, anyway, it's just nuts. The agricultural subsidy system is horrifying. Let's see, save the lavender farmers of France, Lumberg says. That's funny. Oh, this is interesting from William Hero. The Common Agricultural Policy of the EU, as far as I know, gives subsidies to the most inefficient farmers. And it will never be amended because France gets boatloads of superseeds from the EU and every country needs to agree to change. Boatloads of superseeds. I think he mistyped something. I don't know what that means. And then if a farmer makes a sack of potatoes for 15p and another for £5, the EU will subsidize the first farmer by £4.85. Wow, great system. Okay.
Wow. I heard of the with the EU subsidies, the mountain of butter. Have you ever heard this?
Yes. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. That when I first heard that, I thought that can't be true, and then it was.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And we saw this in the U.S. We talked about government cheese. I think my house even ended up with some government cheese at some point. But it's basically, where the because they're distorting the market. Sometimes that means, like famously in the Soviet system, there would be undersupply of certain things. But also, and this would also happen in the Soviet system, but we've seen this in the United States, there will be oversupply because the government is artificially inducing people to make more of it than the market would have them make. And so you end up with, mountains of butter and government cheese and things like this. Just amazingly insane. Okay, I think that's there's one more I guess I could cover. There's a bit of a difference between gene splicing and crossbreeding. I do not know enough about, I'm hesitant to speak on the topic because this gets into a certain kind of biology stuff that I don't know. I don't know the science on it well enough to speak to it. Some people, like you said, say that gene splicing is really just sort of the next stage of doing crossbreeding, and there's really no dramatic difference between them. Other people seem to think that you're opening up a whole Pandora's box when you go from crossbreeding to gene splicing. I don't know.
I don't know enough, but I think if it helps especially poor nations have cheaper food and people can rise out of poverty, I don't see the problem with it. But I think there's one more by Roger Zat and Don the Pleb.
Okay, I'll get those. Two Plebs says, Don says, with that potato policy, I'm opening up 2 potato farms. One will run efficient. The other will be the least efficient thing that's ever been done. I'll get the price for inefficiency with the scale. And then Rogers says, government cheese, does it tax you? And one last one, William Hero says, I saw on the EU website that the Common Agricultural Policy is 20% of their budget. Oh, that must mean that they are spending that much, like on subsidies and such things, right? Because this wouldn't just be the the fact that there's regulations. It would be that the regulations end up requiring them to take tax money and hand it to some farmer somewhere or whatever.
Yeah, so, exactly. Yeah. This is ridiculous.
Yeah,
I'm gonna be glad when the EU dies.
Right, I know, it's really rough. Okay, anyway, thanks. I think we'll stop there, and we have switched to this to not compete with AA. As it was pointed out, now we're competing with the Britishers' History Hour, which I recommend. This Week in History, I think it's called. It's a great show. But I think we're doing better off, even with the numbers I'm seeing. I think we're a little better off than we were going head to head against Academic Agent Cigar Stream. So let's try it on at this day and time for a while, every other week, as we've been doing. All right. Thanks, Mad Merc.
Have a good one.